Welcome to the Eagle Claw YouTube channel. Putin acted on February 24th, not thinking that the size of the war in Ukraine would grow to this extent. The Russian army, which entered the territory of Ukraine, has been defeated many times since February 24th. The biggest defeat of the Russian army, which suffered heavy defeats on land and in the air, was at sea. By blocking the Ukrainian coast from the sea, Russia's Black Sea Navy initially showed that it was the most critical role in the war. Afterwards, a great chaos environment descended on the Russian Navy like a dark cloud, because Ukraine hit its first Russian naval target with Neptune strike anti-ship missiles in April. This ship was Russia's Black Sea Fleet flagship, Moskva. The sighting of the most popular ship of the Black Sea Fleet as it descended to the bottom of the sea near the Snake Island was the first sign of Ukraine's victory at sea. This event was seen as a flare, and the Ukrainian attacks continued in the following days. While the Russian Navy suffered serious damage from the attacks carried out by Ukraine, they had to leave Snake Island at the end of June. In particular, the sending of Harpoon anti-ship missiles to the region caused the Russian Navy to lose all its influence. But the last days have brought bigger nightmares for the Russian Navy. The advance of the Ukrainian armed forces in Kherson and the attacks in Crimea drove the Russian army from its safest port in the Black Sea. Having made a withdrawal from the Sevastopol port, the Russian army had to withdraw the warships in this area. The Russian Navy is now in a blockade in the Black Sea, and its movement areas are restricted. The American-made Harpoon anti-ship missiles with a range of 150 kilometers, and the Swedish-made RBS-15 anti-ship missile systems with a range of 280 kilometers, deployed by the Ukrainian Navy forces on Snake Island and the coast of Odessa, completely disabled the effectiveness of the Russian Navy. 3 days after the war between Ukraine and Russia broke out, Turkey closed the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Strait to Russian warships, thus trapping Russia's Black Sea Fleet with the legendary operations of the Ukrainian Navy. The withdrawal of the Russian Navy from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk in late September was an admission of this. Turkey's activity in the Black Sea prevented the Russian Navy from operating comfortably on the Ukrainian coast. During the hot conflicts in the Black Sea, the southern and western parts of the Black Sea were constantly monitored by the Turkish Bayraktar TB2 and the northern part by the Ukrainian Bayraktar TB2, and the Russian Navy was constantly monitored closely. In addition, Turkey recently completed the construction of the flagship of the Ukrainian Navy, which it built for the Ukrainian Navy. On October 2nd, the First Lady of Ukraine and the Admiral of Ukrainian Navy sent the Ukrainian Navy ship to the Black Sea with a ceremony held in Turkey. This limited range of movement of the Russian Black Sea Fleet may cause them to be unable to move more easily and eventually become useless. Let's continue to explore this subject in a little more detail. The fleet and air wing of the Russian Federation's Black Sea Fleet have been battered by Ukraine's missile and drone attacks, and the once feared Russian naval force has become an afterthought. Russia's Black Sea Fleet was once at the center of Vladimir Putin's attempt to conquer Ukraine, but that fleet and its accompanying air wing have been battered by innovative Ukrainian missile and drone strikes, transforming the once feared force into an afterthought in Europe's biggest war in 7 decades. When Putin launched an all-out invasion of Ukraine in February, the Crimea-based fleet was at the center of the action, launching Caliber cruise missiles at military and civilian targets deep in the country, blocking access to the country's ports and posing a threat. But since those early days, Kiev has taken the initiative, as missile strikes and mysterious explosions have upset the Russian fleet, sunk many ships, including the flagship cruiser Moskva, and devastated the Crimea-based air wing in a dramatic attack. Although the Black Sea Fleet was strong enough to keep the small Ukrainian Navy at bay, it was never the pride of the Russian Navy. The Severomorsk-based Northern Fleet is by far the Kremlin's largest and most modern force, sending some of its own ships to aid just before the Russian invasion. But the Crimea-based fleet was expected to play a major role in holding down Ukrainian forces in the south, to defend the occupied peninsula, while defending against an expected amphibious attack that never came. While Russian submarines occasionally opened fire on Ukraine, the fleet could not live up to the expectations set at the beginning of the war and decided to take a defensive crouch in the harbor or on the open sea to avoid a Ukrainian attack. At this point, the Russian Navy seemed completely helpless, and the Black Sea Fleet, which was Putin's favorite, fell into disgrace. The situation in which this navy, which challenged the British Navy ships in the Black Sea last year, started to become deplorable. Since the spring, the problems of the Black Sea Fleet have increased as a result of bad leadership, outdated equipment, and an arrogance that the Ukrainians are more than happy to exploit. Russia's Black Sea Fleet showed that the fleet lacked seriousness in preparing, positioning, and conducting operations in the face of the threat of a Ukrainian resistance. Ukrainian resistance in the Black Sea was fierce. Ukraine's self-developed Neptune anti-ship missile that sank Moscow and Denmark-donated Harpoon missiles, which sank a Russian supply ship this spring, forced the Russian fleet to stay in the open and out of the war for months. Alexander Turchinov, Ukraine's former acting president and former secretary of the country's National Security and Defense Council, who initiated the Neptune project, said he was proud of the missile. A Neptune missile also hit the frigate Admiral SN in April, Turchinov said. However, Russia managed to shoot down the second missile targeting the ship due to the time between launches. In other words, it has become legendary that Ukraine's own-made missiles sent the most powerful Russian frigate to the dark waters of the Black Sea. Not only was the cruiser Moskva sitting in the bottom of the Black Sea, days of Ukrainian drone and missile attacks on the Russian-occupied Snake Island in May and June damaged or destroyed several small landing and transport ships that the Russians had anchored aboard the strategic ship. The Turkish-made Ukrainian Bayraktar TB2 became legendary once again in the Snake Island War, and became the first armed unmanned aerial vehicle to sink at least 5 Russian amphibious warships and hit Moskva's missile defense systems in the history of naval warfare. This mobilized many world navies, especially the U.S., and drone carrier warships consisting of unmanned armed aerial vehicles, such as TB2, began to take their place in the history of naval warfare. Drone carrier warships are currently operating in the U.S. and Turkish navies. The attacks on Snake Island also eliminated several modern air defense and radar systems, eventually ending Russia's naval and air dominance and returning a significant piece of land to Kiev's control. The battle for Snake Island showed that the Russian fleet had no response to Ukrainian attacks, and Russia's abandonment of the island left its ships at sea more vulnerable to Ukrainian attacks. It should be very clear that the losses of the Russian amphibious ships were probably more significant than Moscow's. The losses hampered Russia's ability to move troops and equipment by sea around Crimea, and made the Russians more hesitant to use modern landing craft transferred from the Northern and Baltic fleets just before the war. The reluctance of the Russian Navy to use warships as a fighting force has rendered the fleet impotent, and they have been waiting for several months completely dysfunctional. The Russian Black Sea Fleet has been disrupted and is now used as a defensive force only with occasional cruise missile attacks. In fact, 15 days ago, the Navy of Ars moved the fleet from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk, declaring that it was completely trapped. Keeping the fleet in good standing at sea severely limits Russia's sailing options in southern Ukraine. The fleet itself, consisting of small corvettes and frigates loaded with missiles, a landing craft, and 6 submarines, still has more than 30 ships at sea or in port, but after Moscow's air defense and radar, their effectiveness and maneuverability were severely hampered. As the dominance of the Snake Island was taken over by Kiev, it meant that the Russian Navy lost the most important fortress in front of them, so they were completely defenseless. The attacks they saw in the West and the publicity they received did not go unnoticed by Putin. The Ukrainian operation to sink Moskva, the Snake Island operation, and the Crimean operation in August forced Putin to fire his admirals several times. The replacement of the senior admiral of the Black Sea Fleet was covered in Russian state media. Despite evidence to the contrary, it was interpreted as an almost unheard-of move by a regime that prioritized the projection of power and authority. Look, Putin constantly draws the results of his own desperation from his generals, and completely destroys the atmosphere of trust in his own army. Now, senior officers fear that they will be demoted at any moment. At the same time, the Russian army, which has lost to its generals, acts in an undisciplined manner by not showing any loyalty to its new commanders. This strategy, which Putin applies as a method of self-protection, actually lays dynamite under the Russian army and causes them to lose more and more each day. Even if Putin, who is trying to continue on his way with more faithless and novice soldiers every day, wants to legitimize his invasion of Ukraine with unlawful decisions, it seems like nothing will go well for them anymore. Such factors clinch the trapping of the Russian army both in the Ukrainian lands and in the Black Sea. Don't forget to follow our channel to be informed about current developments and reports with our independent analysis and expert comments. Thanks for watching.